Welcome back to the Bob Fu Report, where we bring you updates from China regarding religious freedom, human rights, and rule of law. My name is Jonathan Dingler, filling in for Bob this week. And this week, we have a very special conversation with Hannah Nation. She's the managing director for the Center of House Church Theology, and she's one of the editors of the newly released Faithful Disobedience, a collection of essays from Pastor Wang Yi and other house church pastors. Now, we've covered Wang Yi pretty extensively here on the Bob Fu Report. Many of you are very familiar with his case, charged with inciting subversion of state power and illegal business operations, given a 9-year sentence, and his family is closely monitored day in and day out. His son is escorted to school, all of that sort of thing. And some of you may even be familiar with his joint statement of faith that was signed by over 400 house church pastors and leaders. And some of you may even be aware of the statement that he penned preparing to be imprisoned. But what else has Pastor Wang Yi written, and what are the house church leaders thinking at this clearly very formative time of persecution? Faithful Disobedience does a really great job of not only translating and giving us a lot of these writings and essays, but also helps Westerners and Americans kind of figure out what not only their stances on church-state relations, but also their theology and their background. What makes the house church what it is in China? Now, I'm very excited for you to listen to this conversation with Hannah. She's got a lot of really great things to say, and I really hope that you check out Faithful Disobedience, and you can find here on the screen where to purchase it. And I hope you enjoy this really, really rewarding interview. So I just wanted to start off with, so in your introduction, which I encourage everyone to read, you kind of break a lot of presuppositions about house churches. When and how did your perspective shift, in this project, or like maybe before this project?
I've been involved with China now for almost 20 years. I first went to China in 2005. And I'm not sure I'd say there was a specific moment that kind of started to shift my perspective, but I'd say definitely the more involved I got, the more I listened and learned, the more I started to feel like there were a lot of misconceptions about house churches. I think especially in the years leading up to 2018, obviously there's been just a significant uptick in persecution since 2018. But in probably 5 years leading up to 2018, we just saw a lot of things taking place across China, a lot of openness in China. And I started also just thinking about just the size of the church in China. And, missiologically, the kind of 5 to 7% of a population number is a really significant number for whether you consider a country reached or not. And whatever the estimates for numbers of Christians in China are, we're hovering somewhere around those numbers. So just even in terms of the numerical size of Christianity in China, I think some of our misconceptions about the church really need to change, and we need a fuller, better picture of what we're talking about when we're talking about Christianity in China.
Right, it's not a bunch of Christians huddled in like a little shack with like a little candle and maybe like a stolen copy of the ESV or something. I mean, they're they're in real buildings, they're renting out these spaces.
Yeah. And I always say to people, it's China. Anything you can find both sides of a statement. So, it's extremely large. It's extremely diverse in terms of the realities of the church. So personally, I know house church pastors who are renting hotel space and meeting very, very openly, surprisingly so, even given the realities of kind of the post new regulations reality in China and also COVID. Um, but at the same time, I also know churches that are under, extreme duress and do have more of a not secretive. I wouldn't say secretive, but
Maybe
more
like
of a
cautious.
cautious, wanting to remain below the radar presence. And so it's very diverse. But I think, yeah, we're really not talking about a lot of the just even images that you might see. Sometimes I pay attention to what images news sources are using of house churches. And I think often a lot of the images don't really fit what the current reality is. You'll see a lot of images that strike me as probably 20 to 30 years old. Um, and the reality today is much more urban, much more educated and middle class, and just a very different landscape in terms of the Christianity in China and the house churches in China.
Right, because I feel, me and not only at work here, but in my personal life, I share clips of Wang Yi, which you can find online, which people are it's almost like this weird thing for them, cognitive
Yeah.
dissonance of like, wait, they're filming this?
Yeah.
Like they
Yeah.
can do that? It's like, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the things that I love to highlight too is that especially I think because of these demographic changes, the house churches are becoming more and more involved in mercy ministries. And yeah, I think they've always been involved in taking care of the poor within their congregations, but they definitely have become much more engaged in things where um, they are thinking carefully and thinking hard about their resources and the resources that have been given to them, and how to use those in their city and how to bless others with this kind of new urban, more financially stable reality of the house church.
Right, which actually in probably the second or third chapter, Pastor Jin of Beijing Shuwang Church, he mentions that now they've kind of moved away almost from not that this is a bad thing, but they were praying fervently for financial provision and all these things, but now they're having to actually put in the work to prepare almost like a budget and all this other stuff, which kind of piqued my interest because are they moving more into, obviously it's a little bit different, but there's clearly some kind of similarity between American churches and Christian Chinese house churches, because I almost feel sometimes that we do that as well, but we kind of lose that central part of prayer. What do you think about that?
What the role of prayer is in their churches?
Right.
I'm sorry, is that the question?
Yeah. Right.
Oh yeah. I mean, the Chinese house churches, they are deeply committed to prayer. And from my vantage point, I don't see that receding in their landscape, which is something I find extremely encouraging. I do think that the recent increases in persecution are part of why even the younger generations are remaining very fervent and committed to prayer. I know of, just in the last year, many house churches realizing that in this time of increased pressure, they need to recommit to prayer and learn even more about being faithful in prayer. They've been doing prayer trainings, and it's not just the older generation who's involved in that. Many of the young believers are participating in these prayer trainings, and it's really encouraging and deeply convicting to me that they they get up early in the morning, they pray, and they get a lot of people in their churches to participate. My church locally, um, we struggle to do similar things, where we don't have that kind of sense of need, I think, for prayer that the Chinese house churches have. And I think that's something we can really learn about from them is prayer and the role of prayer, and not only the individual believer's life, but the life of a church, and the life of, a corporate body of believers.
Right, and that's something that I found so interesting just reading more about Wang Yi is that there's definitely within house churches there's this emphasis on the individual, but Wang Yi kind of takes it where other house church pastors are doing this too, but the whole church should be doing this, not just
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
pastor or the elders.
Mhm.
But
Yeah, he's very concerned about um churches understanding their identity as a church, and understanding that so much of the Christian life is not just about an individual walk with Jesus, but it's about a people and a family, together witnessing and testifying to the reality of Christ. And I think so many of his points really hinge on that. you know, um, I think you have to understand Wang Yi's appreciation for corporate faith and the church in order to really understand the heart of his arguments often.
right, right. So kind of going off of one of the things that we can learn about the Chinese house church being fervent prayer, what do you think is I saw also on House Church Ministries a post about how we have more in common with the house church movement than we do with John Calvin and some of the Reformationists and stuff. What do you think is like the biggest comparison that we can kind of draw from them in the
Mm,
U.S. church?
mm. Well, I think one of the things they talk about quite a lot, not only Wang Yi, but many, many house church pastors, is this question of where the church's ultimate allegiances lie, and one of the things I love about, for sure, Wang Yi's writings is that, he's talking about church and state. That's part of the title of the book. And I think often as Americans, we kind of can maybe think of that as a very, abstract or kind of theoretical, or philosophical topic. It's not really something, for example, you often hear preached about um, in your average church setting. But I think for Wang Yi, it's a very practical topic, and he does such a good job of tying it back to matters of the heart and our walk with Christ, because he has a really good understanding of how much this debate about the church's relationship to the state really, in the end, boils down to this question of who do we love the most, and where are our ultimate allegiances in life. And so I think, even if in the US, we're not facing the same things that our brothers and sister in China are facing, um, that's a question that's very applicable for all people around the world, and we all face temptations, to put a whole host of things as our highest allegiance above Christ and our highest love above Christ, whether that's your family, whether that's material gain and comfort, whether that's cultural prestige and power, or whether that's, safety, pure and simple. But I think Wang Yi and so many house church pastors are so good at calling us to remember that, um, the Christian life is about following a king, and he demands our entire allegiance. And there will be a cost to that at times. Not always a conflict with the state, um, but wherever that idol, is being challenged, then we will have to examine our hearts and, ask ourselves where our allegiances are.
Yeah, and I think that's so interesting. Obviously, reading part of this and just following um, the Chinese Christian house church movement, here at China Aid, they are continually facing this issue, but they're not as most of the pastors are not as vocal because of obviously the pressure that lies within that. But I mean, they're having to put up, in the TPSM churches, the Three Self-Patriotic Movement churches are putting up the communist flag or Chairman Mao and Xi Jinping right next to the cross and all those things. So it's really right at the forefront of the issues that they deal with. And I feel like for us, it's almost so implicit that we might not even think about it.
Yeah. I think your point is right on, and I think you're right. Not every house church pastor, I would say most house church pastors, are not as vocal as Wang Yi. It's important to remember that Wang Yi is an exception.
Very much a special case.
Very much a special case, yeah. But I think it's not. There are many house church pastors who would very strongly disagree with Wang Yi on many things. But I do think many that I know would say they generally agree with Wang Yi's points. They don't necessarily agree with Wang Yi's points. They don't always agree with his tactics or some of the methods that he has used. But in terms of, I think, his basic theology, in terms of his understanding of the church and what it means to be the church, there's probably more agreement than disagreement. The disagreement often comes about with regards to kind of his methods and some of the public nature of what he says and what he does. So, but yeah, he's definitely. I would not say he's your average
Right.
church pastor,
right,
by any means. He's a very unique case and a very interesting one to follow because of that.
Right. And I always somewhat forget about his influence, but we have a group of Christians, Shenzhen Holy Reformed, or the Mayflower Church. They left Shenzhen in 2019, I think. And I was in South Korea with them for some time, and I was speaking to some of the older kids, and they were actually studying some of Wang Yi's house church history course.
Interesting. Yeah. That's really interesting. Yeah. No, I mean, he's always been a very popular writer, and and I think that goes back even before he became a Christian. He's a very gifted writer and thinker, and I think I always say, it's a good writer when they're just as fun to read in another language as the original language that they wrote in. Because so much can be lost in translation. Part of it depends on a good translator.
Right.
And thankfully, we've had really, really wonderful translators working with us. But still, nonetheless, I think the best writers are writers that can be translated and remain powerful to read, when it's in another language.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that too, because there's a lot of things that he says or writes. I mean, I've watched a lot of his sermons that are on YouTube that are in English. But I definitely, there's a lot of things that he says that kind of strike a chord with me. But I wanted to read one of those here in a second. But you say that kind of one of the most pivotal moments in Wang Yi's theology is this chapter called Christ, His History Written Large. And so that's one of his essays where he's kind of shifting from preparing to be imprisoned. And so I just wanted to read this part because I thought this is what struck a chord with me, and then I wanted to see what else, because you've been very familiar with his work, what has struck a chord with you in the past. But
yeah,
he says, for this reason, it is good for some to make money for the Lord. It is better for others to be imprisoned for the Lord. It is good for some to live for the Lord, and it is better for others to die for the Lord. I don't know, there's so many things that strike a chord with me in his writing, but that has just such a great cadence in English. I'm not sure how it comes across in Chinese, but I just love it.
Yeah, no, that essay is an extremely important one. That whole section of the book, I think, really helps to show the ways that he, around that time, just there were a lot of things I think that were impacting him, helping him think more and more as a theologian. And I don't think he ever has or ever will set aside his legal background and um, just that lens for viewing things. But I think the closer to 2018, he got really, I think, just this topic of eschatology, which is a big word, but really just means thinking about where we're headed and our end destiny in life, not only as individuals, but as the church and as the world. Those questions just start to shape his thinking so much and really shape this whole question of how the church is supposed to engage with the state. And I think, he's most famous for My Declaration of Faithful Disobedience, which he wrote in the lead up to his arrest in the fall of 2018. But I think, and there's so much in there. You can read that alone and get a good taste of who Wang Yi is and where he's coming from. But I think in order to fully understand what he's saying there, you do have to have at some point read History of Christ written large, in part because it helps give just the bigness of the picture that he's thinking about. It's a large reality that he's contemplating. And so when he says in My Declaration of Faithful Disobedience that it's not about a fight for individual rights, it's about testifying to another world. When you read that and you've read a lot of his other work, you understand that he's thinking about the end of time. He's thinking about what is the end goal and the end purpose of this whole reality that we live in. And when you start to think in that big picture and that big scope, then I think the question of individual rights, it doesn't disappear, but it gets recast in this, eternal light that is so clear Wang Yi's seeing everything in. Everything that he's doing, everything he's thinking about and deciding, he's doing in this in the shadow of eternity, And then that really comes through in History of Christ written large. I think it always also really comes through in another essay called The Cross and the Landfill.
Oh, yeah.
And that one it's really short. Was I believe it was a pastoral letter. And but in it he gives this illustration that I think is also just incredibly important for understanding his perspective. He talks about how the church in this world is like a ballet dancer dancing on a garbage dump, essentially, and how the contrast between this beautiful ballet dancer and the garbage dump, just all it does is highlight the beauty that is to come and the beauty that we wait for. And that again is just this kind of big picture idea that has to be in the background of any conversations about rights or conflict with the state. And it's really important to understand those things when thinking about his theology.
I just love that big picture of kind of having that at the almost like the background of all of these conflicts, because I don't know about you, but being in this environment and working, serving the house church, it can be pretty overwhelming, very rewarding, but also very overwhelming and just difficult overall. Is
Yeah.
is that kind of that same background of that ballet dancer and the dump? Is that kind of what maybe not like keeps you in it, but does that like give you hope or keep your head above water, or do you have a different perspective?
No, I would say for sure. I mean, I think, yeah, I feel like, yeah, it is hard work. um, it's hard work and it's hard, on many different fronts. Um, but I think that it's hard to look at the house churches in China and to think about their history over the last, 70 some years and not just really be marveled by what God is doing in China. And I think that when it is discouraging or when it's frustrating and tiresome, um, it's really important to step back and see the big picture, and to see how the Lord is at work in this world. In the 1950s, when um, the CCP came to power and the Western world was entirely kicked out, people truly thought it was the end of the church in China. And I think it's just incredible the ways that that has not been the case, that God preserved a church, a faithful church, throughout the 20 to 30 years of really harsh persecution and suffering in the end of the 20th or second half of the 20th century. And then how, when China began to open up, there's just this massive explosion of the gospel across China. And you have to remember the history in a sense to feel the awe
Right.
of where things are. And so even though we are in another time of increased difficulty, I think this is where it's important to remember the history, and I think that's why it is important for the house churches to know their history. It's important for the house churches. I think it's important for all Christians to know their history, but I think especially when you're facing some of the things that the house churches face in China, being able to recall the Lord's faithfulness in the past is so important. And I think being able to recall his faithfulness in the past and being able to accurately understand what your end destiny is, that is what keeps you, in a healthy place while you undergo the things that they go through.
Right. Man, I've really loved just getting into, like you said, the history of the house church movement from the perspective of some of these modern leaders. It does give you more encouragement, and it does make me interested to see, because the house church movement isn't just surviving for the last 50 years or 70 years. I would say it's doing quite well, and now they're reaching out and trying to have this global conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm interested to see how, with this book, how that can be the start. Obviously there's been other books and other things, but how books like this can be the start of this global conversation between these two different churches. Well, it's all one church, right? But
I'm very passionate about helping facilitate that conversation, because I think you're exactly right. The house church movement in China, it's not just a surviving movement. Despite everything, it is thriving, and the Lord has continued to just grow their numbers and to mature their leaders, and to mature the churches. And I think that one of the things that I care quite a lot about is thinking about how we can help the house churches encourage churches in other persecuted contexts, because I think they, if you think about um, just the global church today, the Chinese house churches are one of the oldest, longest lasting, um, persecuted churches, actively persecuted churches. So they have quite a wealth of wisdom to share with churches, younger churches, in other contexts that are also, suffering. And I really, really think helping facilitate that global conversation is important, and helping to, um, show other churches in other contexts that um, it's not just the American church that has resources to give. Um, the house churches have so many resources to give, um, and especially on these topics of how to endure in suffering, and how to be faithful as a church under persecution.
Hmm. Well, Hannah, thank you again so much for joining us. I know that there are so many nameless people behind this call and behind this book, and so thank you to all of you who put in just hours of work into this, and thank you, Hannah, for sitting in here and being with us to have this great conversation. You can order this book at the link in our description. You'll also see a link on your screen. But thank you so much, Hannah, again, and God bless you.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.